Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jessica, and I am a librarian at the Chelmsford Public Library. And I'm here with Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, and we're going to get started in just a moment. But tonight, we welcome back Jeff Klapes. Jeff Klapes is the Traveling Librarian. He is recently retired head of reference services at the Lucius B. Memorial Library in Wakefield, Massachusetts, and an avid traveler and photographer. He has been everywhere, and we have showcased, and he's been wonderful about creating these programs while he does it, and sharing it with us. So tonight we are going to go to Miami. It's a great time of year for this kind of program, I think. So we'll talk about the series. Oh, sorry. This month we'll be staying in the US, just 3 hours by plane down the East Coast, visiting Miami, Florida. Known for its lovely weather and fine beaches, Miami has much more to offer, including Art Deco architecture, trendy ethnic neighborhoods, museums, and lush botanical gardens. I would love to be there, although it's getting kind of nice around here, so I can't complain. Yeah. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jeff. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks. And because we are in webinar mode tonight, if anyone has any, if you've come to these programs before, you know how it works. If you have any questions, feel free to either pop them in the chat or the Q&A part of your Zoom program, and I'll keep an eye on that as we go through and try to answer them. But anything that we miss at the end of the program, we'll go back and play catch up and check any questions that came up that we didn't catch on the way through. So I will get started and share my screen. And I think yep, okay, that looks good. So we'll get started. As Jess said, it's I know a lot of the programs that I've done have not been have been to more exotic destinations around the world, but I actually do like traveling in the United States. And somehow recently I just was in the mood. Part of it was timing, part of it was money. It was kind of nice to just get away and go away for a few days. So I took this trip just a year ago. I had been to Miami at least a couple of times on family vacations when I was younger, but I really hadn't been there back as an adult to see what Miami has to offer recently. And of course, it's changed quite a bit since I was a kid. It's only about 3 hours or so by air. There's plenty of direct flights from Boston. And of course, as you know, it's one of the most popular tourist destinations in the country. It's hard to believe, though, that only about 100 years ago, barely, it was swamp and there was almost nobody there, like a couple thousand people. Here we are flying in over the Barrier Islands. If you've been to Florida, I'm sure everybody's been to Florida at some point. Probably a lot of you have been to Miami. So you know kind of the general geography. It's flat as a pancake, but all along both the east and the west coast, actually, there's a lot of barrier islands, and you can see them as we come in here. And in fact, if you can see my pointer, much of what this island here is Miami Beach, which is where I stayed, although I did explore a lot of the other neighborhoods back on the mainland. Miami Beach is about 4 miles off the mainland coast via a couple of causeways. Modern Miami has about 6 million people. It's about the 8th largest metro area now in the United States. And it was settled by Spain, who were in Florida long before anybody else was from Europe. And in fact, before New England had any people in it. But it wasn't really until about 1820, 1821 that the US bought this land from Spain. What's kind of interesting that I didn't actually realize until I was reading up on it is that during the time period before it became a US territory in 1821, slavery was actually outlawed in Florida. And then there was a period in the first half of the 19th century, basically, where slavery became legal and illegal and legal and back to illegal. And it wasn't until obviously later events during the Civil War and after that changed things there. And at that point, Florida was a state. In 1821, it became a territory, but in the 1840s, it became a full state. you can kind of see from looking at maps or satellite views that a significant part of southern Florida is just natural, mostly the Everglades, although some other parks as well. And the development is really focused only along the coasts. Through much of the 19th century, Florida was farm country, mostly sugar and citrus crops. And you may have heard of Henry Flagler, who was an important industrialist. He was connected with the oil industry and is famous for turning North Florida from St. Augustine and that area down through Jacksonville into a tourist destination in the mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century. But it really wasn't until the 1890s that he extended the railway all the way down to Miami, which at the time had almost nobody in it, and it was quite a risk, financial risk to do that. But eventually the population and development grew, especially through the teens in the 20th century. And by 1920, there were about 30,000 people in Miami, although compared to today, that's obviously still quite small. And again, as you can see, even today, the development is really cramped along the coast and pretty much surrounded by swamp. The Big Cypress Preserve and the Everglades National Park goes all the way down to the Keys. The Great Hurricane of 1926, obviously there's been many hurricanes in Florida, but the one in 1926 was particularly bad. And also the Depression in the late 1920s took a toll as well. And then in the 30s, things started to pick up again because interestingly, a number of Jewish developers from the north, particularly in New York, came down there and started building numerous Art Deco hotels, and I'm going to show you a bunch of those. They brought that style from the north to Miami Beach and adapted it to a kind of unique deco style that is specific to the South, and has now become one of the most popular aspects of tourism in Miami. There was also another big spurt of growth after two very important developments, which you might not think of off the top of your head, but it becomes obvious why these were so important. The first was the development of air conditioning. Florida was actually a pretty unpleasant place to stay for the first several decades when people went down there. The weather was miserable and sticky and hot, and there were hurricanes and so forth. And of course, a huge number of insects, particularly mosquitoes. So the second development was that somebody figured out how to make mosquito repellent. So as we move into the 30s, 40s, 50s, that really changed how people vacationed, because you could now go to Florida and stay cool in an air-conditioned building, and mosquito repellent made it a lot easier to be outdoors. Just to give you the general geography, we're going to focus tonight mostly on downtown Miami and Miami Beach, and look at some of the neighborhoods. We're going to head down to one of their most famous museums, which is a beautiful mansion a little bit south of Miami. And we're also going to go inland a little bit to Coral Gables, which is quite pretty. And we'll end down in the Botanical Garden, the Fairchild Botanical Garden, which is about, I don't know, 15 miles or so south of the city, which is also quite stunning. Zooming in a little bit, you can see a little bit more clearly Miami Beach and the causeway that links it back to the mainland. Miami actually has a river, believe it or not. It's not much of one. It's only, I think, 5 miles long or so. But they've, in recent years, tried to develop it as a focal point within the city with development around it and pedestrian walkways and so forth. And of course, there's all the other islands, some natural, some man-made, around the area as well, that have development and beaches and condos. And the most important one probably is Dodge Island, which is completely artificial, but this is the primary cruise port, where you'll see 10 or 15 cruise ships lined up one after the other. Miami's had a lot of bad periods in its history in the 20th century, particularly like the 1960s through the 80s, when there was much higher crime, drugs, racial tensions, and things like that. A lot of that has improved significantly since then, and development is really booming. Although, as You can imagine COVID really did a job on tourism, but that has bounced back quite a bit in the last year or so. I stayed in Miami Beach when I was there, South Beach specifically, which is the part as far down as you can get towards the tip of the island. Technically, Miami Beach is a separate city, and it stretches along 8 miles of this barrier island. The island actually used to be a peninsula connected to the mainland, but a few miles up at Bal Harbor, there is an artificial cut through, so it is technically an island. This photograph shows you the very southernmost point where there's a nice breakwater, and you can see the gorgeous beaches and the high-rise condos along the way. I stayed in a really nice old Art Deco hotel called the Sherbrooke. Because Miami has only been a city for really about 100 years, most of the architecture that you see is very 20th century in style. This particular hotel is on a street called Collins Avenue, which is one of the main roads, the main north-south arteries through Miami Beach. And it was named for one of the first developers of the city. But Miami Beach is now really very well known for its Art Deco style, most of which was built in the 1930s and 40s, before World War II hit. And it is now a historic district, and there are about 800 registered historic buildings in Miami Beach. In the 1970s, many of them were in danger of being demolished, but fortunately, preservationists got together and were able to save them. And now it really has made a huge difference in tourism there, because it's one of the main reasons why people flock to South Beach. The Art Deco movement, the name, takes its name from an exposition in France called Art Décoratif, which was shortened to Art Deco. And it tends to make reference to very sleek lines. I'm sure you're familiar with Art Deco in a lot of other places you might have visited. There are very geometric designs. It has a very space-agey kind of feel, very clean styles. And they make use of very modern building elements too, like metal, glass brick, and so forth. This is the sign on the inside of the hotel. And the interesting iron fence on the outside, the railing. In a completely different style, right across the street was this odd little old house, which turned out to be abandoned, right across from my hotel. And it's made of coral. I never found out its story. It had a no trespassing sign, but I don't know whether it's for sale or what its deal is, but it was kind of funny to see it in the midst of all this other much bigger development in downtown Miami Beach. There are several causeways that link Miami Beach and all the barrier islands back to the mainland, and you can see the downtown skyscraper district about 4 miles away off in the distance, as well as the shipping port. So in addition to cruising, recreational cruising, there's also an actual shipping port as well. And at the tip of Miami Beach, there's this beautiful park where you can see the entrance to the harbor with all the cruise ships going back and forth. I do want to show you a few Art Deco buildings just to give you an idea of the variety of style. If you think of Deco that you probably have seen in places like Chicago or New York, Miami Deco is much lighter. It's more whimsical, it's kind of frothy, and certainly much more colorful than what you would see, say, at Rockefeller Center or the Chrysler Building. And glass brick is also a very common element. This tower that you can see in this photograph, actually, with the circular tower that's almost all glass brick, it actually lights up at night and has a light show, which is quite something to see. And on Ocean Drive, which is parallel to the waterfront, the main north-south drag right closest to the beach and the water, there are all kinds of very nice buildings, many of which are now hotels, shops, restaurants, and most of them are only a few stories high. When you get into the historic district here, the big skyscrapers are much further north and much further south. Before COVID, Ocean Drive was a two-way street. And then they closed it during COVID and reopened it as a one-way street, which is much nicer for pedestrians and bike. You can see there are the green bike lanes, and it's much easier for strolling. And it dampens the traffic a little bit. So it's really made an improvement for visitors. I should point out also to this building here, which is very modern, but still has definitely a Florida feel to it, is actually a CVS. Here's a couple of examples of some of the earlier hotels. In fact, the Colony, the one on the left, the blue one, was the very first hotel built in Miami Beach, and the Avalon, the yellowish one on the right, is not too far. And both of these are very good examples of the Deco style with these very long eyebrows, they call them, which cover the windows and provide a little bit of shade and also give a very horizontal feel to the building, which is very typical of Art Deco architecture in the city. This is right across the street from my hotel was a place called Muscle Beach. I don't have muscles, so I didn't hang out there, but there were plenty of people who did. And actually, it's kind of nice. It's part of a much larger park, but this particular section has all kinds of equipment that you can use for exercise. They have volleyball courts and all kinds of stuff. And it was mobbed the entire time I was there. I was there in February, which is obviously a very peak time for being in Florida. And it's all free. You can just help yourself to use these equipment. They have the volleyball courts that you can see in the back. And the beach right behind the bushes is Miami Beach proper. This park is actually part of a much larger park called Lummis Park, which stretches for, a good 10 blocks along Ocean Drive. This particular section is covered with sand and has all these amenities, but there's also fountains and shuffleboard courts and all kinds of other stuff, and parkland and so forth further down. But there's a whole really long stretch here. It's quite nice. And of course, the beach itself, which is very wide, very sandy, nice white, soft sand. All of the resorts that line Miami Beach have their own chairs and umbrellas for their guests, which you would have to be a guest to be able to use them. Or you can pay in some instances, but the beach is still public, so you can stroll the beach and plunk your chair anywhere you want. And it's very deep, very wide, and every few hundred yards is a funky lifeguard station like this one that have been kind of redesigned in a sort of Deco-ish style, and each one has its own personality. There's a whole bunch of different ones painted in bright colors. And you will certainly see plenty of ships going by, whether they be cruise ships heading in or out of the Dodge Island terminal, or you'll also see a lot of container ships going by to the container port. And just inland from the beach, and parallel to it, is a long path, many miles long, which is specifically for pedestrians, cyclists, dog walkers, skateboarders, whatever. And it's a really nice place for walks along the seashore while avoiding traffic. And they even have water fountains that you can drink from, and lots of cut-throughs to get to the main roads. And most of the accommodations along the beachfront have direct access to this, but it's a great way to walk up and down. And it literally goes, I think I walked a good 8 miles on it before I gave up and turned around. Down at the very tip of Miami Beach, you can see the South Point Park that I showed earlier, which has a breakwater, and also a very nice pier that you can fish from if you're interested, and some very expensive condos down at high rises down at the very tip. But also very nice public parks that go along the channel. And this is a great place for people to hang out late in the afternoon or the evening, because you get nice sunset views, and you can watch the cruise ships coming and going. Many of the cruise ships tend to leave in the early evening, so it's a nice time to watch them on their way out of the channel out to the open sea. You can also see the downtown skyline way off in the distance, which is pretty impressive. Here's a line, you can see a line of the cruise ships along the terminals and the skyscrapers of the downtown in the distance. And at night, it's quite impressive as well because it's all lit up. It's kind of interesting to think that decades ago, Miami Beach was put on the map by people like Jackie Gleason, who performed there in clubs. And later on, it was Miami Vice back in, I guess that was the 80s, when everybody was dressing like the guys in Miami Vice, and kind of brought Miami back into people's minds as a vacation destination. Now it's cruising and the Art Deco stuff really are the two, aside from the weather and the beaches, obviously. But the Deco historic district and the fact that it's an enormous cruise ship port has really made an incredible difference. Here are some of the ships on their way out. And they literally go right in front of the pier, so you get an excellent view if you hang out there in the afternoon. If you want, you can even try to be a little bit more zen, find your inner peace in the park like this guy. Florida, of course, is known for being a place where people retire to. And I have to admit, I was probably the only person on the plane on the way down who wasn't in college when I flew down there last year. But Miami is actually pretty diverse, and Miami Beach as well. The streets and the beaches are full of young people, and there's a very large Black community, Jewish community, LGBT community, and also the city in general, and even just Miami Beach is about 2/3 Hispanic. So it definitely is not just the old retired New Englanders and New Yorkers. There's quite a bit more going on there, and that you'll see in the restaurants and the shops and the cultural stuff. It's a very in-your-face kind of city, I find. It's loud, Miami Beach in particular. It's loud. There's a lot of muscle cars going up and down the street, people wearing amazing outfits. There's partying until all hours of the night. Nightlife is very big in Miami Beach. And there's even stuff like this. I won't even attempt to explain this. I was there more for the architecture and the nice weather. Here's another good example of one of those very long horizontal style deco buildings with glass brick and a tower that's supposed to kind of make you think of a lighthouse. And there's some others. This is the Park Central one, which has some slightly different kind of designs. Many of the buildings of Miami Deco make reference to Mexican and Aztec and other kinds of like traditional designs from other cultures, which is a bit unusual to see on sometimes buildings like this, particularly when they're in odd color combinations with pastels and so forth. This is another good example of a sort of Aztec or Egyptian style. Geometric designs are very popular in these kinds of buildings. This one in particular is worth a visit. This is called the Wolfsonian, and it's now a design museum. It's part of Florida International University. And it opened in 1995 after an extensive renovation of what was originally an old storage building. And the facade is really incredible. And now it has an impressive collection of design exhibits and also a very good research library as part of the university. Here's some other examples along the Collins Ave, which is really the main commercial street. That's a few blocks away from the ocean. And this is the old City Hall, which was built in the 1920s, right after the big hurricane came through. And it was deliberately built kind of as a symbol of rebirth of the city after this major natural disaster. For a long time, it was the tallest building in Miami. And then in 1977, the city outgrew the building and moved to a newer building in another part of town. And the old building has since been restored and now is kind of an art center. They have a museum, they have an excellent bookstore, cinema that has film festivals and so forth in it. But there's also a great mix of just individual people's houses. I love this. This is just a private home on a back street. And I love this doorway that has, it's got Spanish elements, but it's got this, there's cactuses and tropical birds. It's just fun to walk around and see all the details. This one is a good example of using glass brick. And even the modern buildings, buildings that have been built in the last few decades, they may not be deco, but they are still trying to kind of convey a Miami Beach feel to it. And this was a very good example of that with the pastel colors and very much a Miami look to it. This is the Edison, which is another one of the old early hotels from the 1930s. Most of the hotels from that period are actually relatively small and rarely more than 4 or 5 stories high. And that means that most of the beachfront, until you get way down to the southern tip or much further north, it doesn't have the skyscrapery feel of other coastal areas in Florida. It's really, most of the buildings have a fairly limited height, and it feels a little bit more, it's more pedestrian oriented. It doesn't feel quite as overwhelming as a skyscraper city. This is a good example of the kind of deco that makes you think of being on a ship with the ship's railings and like you're standing on the deck of a cruise ship. And a couple of the other more old ones from the 30s. The Leslie on the left is now a boutique hotel that only has about 35 rooms in it, I think. And the one on the right, the Cavalier, is completely covered with stylized palm trees, seahorses, and things like that. There is also, if you're into Art Deco, there's a free Art Deco museum right on Ocean Drive that explains the history of the style, specifically in Miami Beach. And they organize really nice walking tours. So if you want someone to actually take you around and talk in more detail about the buildings that you're seeing, it's a great resource. Here's another one called the Carlisle, which was one of the last to be built. This was from the 1940s. There was a last few, a wave of a few hotels that were built before World War II. And the Cardozo right next door is also very long and kind of looks like a ship and is owned now by the Cuban-American singer Gloria Estefan. And just one after the other, the whole stretch of along Ocean Drive is one beautiful historic building after another. As you get further north, maybe another half mile or mile north of this district, you start to see more high rises, although a number of them are still historic, like the Royal Palm that you can see off in the distance, which is another one that has very definite cruise liner kind of decor. The Palm was built in 1937, but it was very small at the time, and they expanded it years later. And during World War II, along with a number of other hotels in Miami at the time, it was used as barracks for training soldiers before they were shipped off to different theaters of war. This one is called the Lowe's Hotel, and this is huge. It has, I think, 800 rooms now, and is much more recent. It was built in 1998 around an old tower from 1939 on a hotel back then called the San Moritz, but it's been completely eclipsed by this much newer hotel that's been built around it. There's a lot of culture in Miami Beach, surprisingly. We don't always think of Florida that way, but there's a lot of things to do. This building here is called the New World Center, and it was designed by Frank Gehry, who's a very well-known architect. And it was opened just about 10 years ago, and it has a concert hall. The symphony performs there. They have all kinds of other cultural events. It's a very striking building, with very typical oddball design elements that Gary is known for. Even the post office is Deco. This is a 1937 post office that was built as a WPA project. You can see the glass block over the door, and if you stick your head inside, there's a wonderful painted dome inside that drum-shaped part of the building. And again, referring to the Jewish community that I talked about earlier, Temple Emmanuel is an enormous building, which has kind of a weird mix of Moorish and Byzantine elements to it, and this massive copper dome. There's a very active Jewish community in Miami Beach, and I forget how big exactly what the size of the congregation is here, but it's big. And not far away is a very modern convention center. Many of the buildings I've just shown you are kind of in the middle of the long, skinny barrier island. They're a few blocks away from the beach. This was a nice place to stop by. There's a lot of very nice parks, many of which are for activities like sports and playing tennis and other outdoor activities. But they do have a small public botanical garden, which is nice. It's not very big. It's only like 2.5 acres, but it's completely free. And it's just a quiet green oasis away from all the busy city streets around it. It started in the 1960s, but it was completely redone about 15 years ago by a landscape designer, appropriately named Raymond Jungles, of all people. So there's public art nearby and fountains, birds and turtles and lizards and all kinds of things like that. So it may not be very large, but it's a wonderful amenity to feel a little bit apart from the bustle of the city. You'll see a lot of wildlife in Miami. This is the tropics after all. So it is not uncommon to see parrots flying around the city the way we would see blue jays or robins. And there's a lot of lizards and iguanas. Some of which are actually invasive species, and they can be pretty big. They won't hurt you, but in fact, they'll usually run away, but they can be good sized, like 3, 4, or 5 feet long in the middle of a city park. This is another of the lovely parks called Collins Park, named after the same guy that the avenue is named after, with these immense trees. And there's also a very well-known contemporary art museum called the Bass, which has some nice art shows. And just a couple of examples of some more upscale Miami houses. Here's one in a sort of Spanish style, a very contemporary style. I was even surprised by the variety of cleverly disguised or unusual parking garages. Here's 3 examples from downtown. Parking is at a premium in Miami Beach, and I wouldn't bother to get a car unless you're going to spend a lot of time driving, because parking is very expensive there. And most of the older hotels, the ones that were built like in the 30s and 40s, the historic ones downtown, don't have parking because they weren't built with parking and they don't have space around them. So if you have a car, you'll either need to park on the street or you'll need to park in a garage and pay for it. I'm looking at, I should take a quick look at some of the questions and questions. The convention center, I don't believe it was designed by Gary. I'm not 100% positive of that, but I don't think it was Gary. And I would have to look up the huge trees. They almost look like baobabs, and I don't actually remember what type of tree they were. There's a lot of banyans. I'm going to show you some better pictures of banyan trees, and they could have been banyans without the added the extra branches that come down. But I'm not positive of that. I'd have to double check it for you. The botanical garden the one that I was just showing you, I'm trying to remember if it has a formal name. I think it's just like the Miami Beach Botanical Garden, but let me double check that before I go this evening. All around Miami Beach, there's a number of artificial islands that you can probably remember from the map. And they have nice residential enclaves with beautiful views. But it also, as you walk around, it makes it pretty clear how vulnerable Florida is to sea level rise. The Miami area in general averages only about 4 feet above sea level. And so with so much coastal development, it is definitely at risk for not just rising sea levels over long periods of time, but also storms. Anytime there's a hurricane or a storm surge, they have major flooding problems. And obviously it's a hurricane-prone region, so that isn't all that uncommon. In the last century, Miami has had 16 hurricanes that did enough damage to be really major events. Serious damage, and lately they seem to be getting even more. They are taking steps to try and deal with this, but climate change and what you do with it is obviously a very political issue, and it's also very costly. So there's a lot of disagreement about what should be done and how much should be done. Another problem that is connected to flooding is that not only the property damage, but it's when you have a massive incursion of seawater onto the land, that seawater eventually seeps into the freshwater aquifer, which southern Florida relies on for drinking water. And that can cause serious long-term problems as well. So development continues, and they are definitely doing more planning for climate change than in the past. But there's criticism that it has not really been aggressive enough. Florida is certainly one of the more vulnerable places in the country. But for the moment, you'll see incredible amounts of development going on, much of it quite large and right next to the ocean. This is one of the more famous hotels in Miami Beach called the Fontainebleau from 1954, and it's right next door to the equally famous Eden Rock, which you might have heard of. That one was designed by a pretty well-known architect called Morris Lapidus, who was a Ukrainian Jew who came to the US when he was very young. And he became known for a very kind of pop culture theatrical style. And he was one of the first architects to really push a style that eventually became known as Miami Modern. And it kind of succeeded the Art Deco style in the decades after World War II. So it's not specifically Deco, but it has a very distinctive look to it that you can definitely tell it's Florida, and it makes use of bright colors and the kind of modern space-agey elements that were popular in the 50s and 60s. And you'll see as many of these very large new buildings that have been constructed in recent years, some are better than others. Most of them are white, which is kind of good because it means that there's a sort of consistency to the skyline, which gives it a more unified look. But as you can see, there's an incredible amount of high-rise residential building going on. And if you are wealthy enough to hang out in this part of Miami Beach, there are plenty of places to park your yacht if you need to. In fact, maybe right across the street from your hotel. But you do have to be careful. I noticed a lot of signage educating people about manatees, which are endangered now in Florida, mainly because of habitat loss. These are very slow-moving sea mammals vegetarians, and they tend to kind of work their way through a lot of the swampy areas eating underwater vegetation. But because of pollution from a lot of boats and development, and also boating accidents, they're very slow. So it's not uncommon for boats to whack into them and cause serious injuries or death. And in fact, although they are now protected, and they've done a pretty good, there's a campaign to educate people about how to avoid them and help protect them. Even so, in 2021, more than 700 manatees died as a result of pollution or accidents, which is about 1% of the total population, which may not seem like much, but if that happens every year, that's a significant problem for these animals. Miami Beach comes completely alive at night with these wonderful tropical evenings and tons of partying. As I said, it's a very young destination. Here's one of the resorts along Ocean Drive where you can ensconce yourself in one of these little pavilions with pillows and all your best friends and drink in comfortable luxury. But it's fun to walk around at night just to see the lights and the vibrant street life on a lot of these amazing old buildings. And there's a great view back to the downtown skyline, which we're going to see in just a bit. Is it there? The Cuban population in Miami, of course, is very large. And there are plenty of places where you can get delicious Cuban food or other Caribbean style food. And there's lots of outdoor dining, which is hardly a surprise. And I happened to be there kind of when COVID was still, the Omicron variant was still kind of going around. So it was nice to be able to be eating outdoors. And there were really good Cuban restaurants. And you might also not be surprised to know that I had my fill of mojitos too, which are one of my favorite drinks. I must admit, this is octopus. Of course, those of you who know me know that I have Greek ancestry and I'm big into Greek food. And I will say that Cuban octopus is not as good as Greek octopus, but it was still really, really good. I wish I had had time to explore the neighborhood of Little Havana. If I had a couple of extra days, I would have been able to do that. Little Havana is west of downtown, and it's the focus of the Cuban community in Miami, and has the greatest concentration of Cuban stores and restaurants and cultures. I've heard it's getting kind of touristy, but still, it's apparently well worth visiting. There's also Little Haiti, which has a Haitian population, and north of downtown, which I drove through but didn't have time to spend time in, is an area called Wynwood, which is a kind of up-and-coming, trendy urban arts district. So if you have time and are interested in things beyond just the beach and the sun, these are really interesting neighborhoods to explore beyond just the fun and sun on the beach. I'm going to take you also briefly to one of my favorite places, which is about, I want to say 5 or 8 miles south of Miami Beach. It's not far from downtown. I didn't have a car when I was there because I just didn't want to deal with one. And it was pretty easy to take an Uber to most of the places I wanted to go. And it ended up, even though I went to a bunch of places, it was cheaper than renting a car in the end. Vizcaya is the Dade County, it functions as the Dade County Art Museum, but is primarily a mansion along the lines of the kinds of Newport mansions that you'd see here. Or even another rough comparison might be something like the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. However, unlike some of those, it has some of the most magnificent gardens anywhere in America. And I went here, I remembered going as a child, and it kind of, I was very impressed by it as a kid. And it was one of the reasons I ended up getting interested in architecture and design. So I wanted to show you a little bit about what makes it such a special place. This is a historic postcard showing the house, the main house, and the fabulous Italian style gardens. It was built in 1914 to 1916 by James Deering, who was an heir of the International Harvester Company, which was at the time was the fourth largest company in the country. It cost, if you were to build it today, it would cost $60 million. He was from the north, but he had health issues. So like many, he was advised to head south for the lovely climate in Florida. And being wealthy, he decided he would build a massive mansion. Here is a historic aerial photo that I wanted to show you just to give you an idea of the original size of this estate. And a large part of this landscape area no longer exists. It was sold to the Miami Archdiocese, which unfortunately built a kind of ugly modern school building on it and a hospital. But originally the estate had all of this area, developed it into beautiful gardens and parkland. And on the opposite side of the road, if you look over to the left off this direction, it actually had a farm and a village that made the entire estate self-supporting. He was a very demanding client, and he worked with both an architect and an interior designer and a landscape designer for several years. If you read about the construction of the house, it's kind of interesting because there was a lot of drama and difficulty and with very strong personalities. Deering was in the same crowd with John Singer Sargent, Isabella Stewart Gardner, Marion Davies. He definitely traveled in those kinds of wealthy and celebrity circles. Although he himself was actually kind of quiet. The house was built in a very Italian Baroque style, with some other things kind of mixed in. And essentially it's a large square with an open courtyard in the middle. But if you are interested in interior design and architecture and painting, it's a spectacular place to visit. There are a number of different period rooms with pieces that he collected from all over Europe, as well as things that were built specifically for the house. Here are the entrance halls and just some of the details of the interior. This is a reception room built in a French style. And like many buildings like this, like the ones in Newport as well, a lot of what you see was actually brought back over from Europe, from old houses that were being dismantled, or antiques that wealthy Americans were purchasing to build houses that were European in inspiration. The biggest room in the house is this Renaissance hall that has a ceiling that was built in the 16th century and brought over from Europe. And way in the back, you can kind of see there's a pipe organ that is built into the wall, into an Italian altarpiece from a church, from a 16th century church. And the entire room was built around this massive Renaissance fireplace. Three sides of the house have open loggias, which, given the climate, were very desirable because you want to have access to the ocean breezes. And this one, which is on the east, overlooks the bay, Biscayne Bay, and has a model of Ponce de Leon's ship suspended from the ceiling. The ship and the seahorse were symbols that Deering chose as the symbol of the house, so you'll see them in various places throughout. And there's beautiful marble floors and this incredible courtyard, which is 60 feet square and has this gorgeous fountain from the 17th century. Unfortunately, in the 80s, they covered it with this glass roof, which was protection from both storms and also humidity to protect the artworks inside. The house and the grounds were significantly damaged in 1926 during that big hurricane, which was right after Deering died. And Hurricane Andrew in 1992 also did major damage to, particularly to the gardens. So when I was first there as a child, this glass roof wasn't there, and it definitely detracts from the atmosphere, but on the other hand, you can understand why they needed to do it to protect the collections. There are galleries on all sides in Spanish or Italian style, and again, different period rooms. This is an Italian Rococo music room with just unbelievable artwork on the ceilings. Here's the dining room, surrounded with by Renaissance tapestries and an incredible ceiling. This actually is a reproduction ceiling. It's based on an Italian one, but this ceiling was actually built for the house here in Florida. And another one of the open loggias that all the glass doors can be completely opened on both sides to allow for the breezes to come through. This is called the tea room. And it has classical motifs with the muses on the ceiling and so forth. All of the bedrooms, the guest rooms are up on the second floor and in the towers. And there are galleries that run all the way down, or all the way around, looking into the courtyard. And just a couple of examples of some of the bedrooms. There are 9 guest suites, each of which has its own unique interior design style with a theme. This is a Chinese themed room based on Chinese imports. Deering was a lifelong bachelor, so he had his own personal suite. And his sitting room is in the Adams style and is considered probably the finest and most detailed interior in the house. Here's his bedroom, which is in French Empire style. And the bed that you can see over on the left, his bed belonged to Napoleon's second wife. I don't know how he managed to get hold of it, but Maria Louisa was Napoleon's second wife, and that's her bed. And he had a fantastic bathroom attached to it, which has its own little balcony. In the center of the second floor, it looks out over the ocean. And the ceiling is actually made of fabric tinted to look kind of like a Napoleonic military tent. The shaving stand in front of the window is actually plumbed with water and looks out over the bay. And the tub that you can see on the right has 2 sets of faucets, one for fresh water and one for seawater. So you get hot and cold, fresh or seawater, depending on what you were in the mood for. And some other of the guest suites. He had many guests, celebrity guests often, people like Isabella Gardner, Stuart Gardner, people like Marion Davies, and in fact, John Singer Sargent, who I mentioned earlier, was a frequent guest as well, and actually did a number of watercolors of the times that he spent there. This is a sitting room for guests. It was being used for storage while I was there, but I like these kind of ghostly chairs. And up on the second floor, unusually for a house like this, the kitchen was upstairs rather than downstairs. And that was partly because Deering was actually kind of a homebody. He liked to entertain, but in relatively small numbers. And he rarely used that gigantic banquet hall down on the first floor. Most of his entertaining was done in this small dining room up on the second floor that overlooked the gardens, and has a very Chinese theme with murals, painted murals on the walls. Here's the kitchen. And the second floor galleries, the flooring that you can see, these old terracotta tiles, are actually from originals from Cuba that were brought over. And the ceiling is all made of cypress, which is a very durable wood for the South because it tends not to rot when it's exposed to the elements. But as fantastic as the house is, one of the main reasons to visit this is that Vizcaya has probably what are considered to be the best, most magnificent gardens anywhere in the United States. And they really are the history of their development alone is worth reading about. The house was completed in 1916, but it took several more years for all of the gardens to be completed, and even longer, of course, for them to mature, because landscape design is something that takes a long time. You can get to the gardens from the entrance court here through these large gateways which come from a palace in Verona, Italy. And most of the gardens are in a very Italian style. They fan out to the south from the house. And part of the challenge in developing these gardens was to find plants that would grow well, that would look Italian in style, and have that European flair to them, but also would thrive in the Florida climate, and also very close to salt water. This is literally right on the ocean. So salt water affects the growing of the plants, and that they made a lot of mistakes and had to, by trial and error, find out what kinds of things grew well there. This is the eastern facade, which is unfortunately, the day I was there was marred by this big tent, because they were having a, if you're incredibly wealthy, you can get married there. I can't even imagine what that costs. But one of the most unusual parts of the gardens is this breakwater, which is built in the form of a stone barge made from the local stone, which is mostly coral, in fact, and decorated with columns and sculptures. When Deering was still alive, it was even planted with palm trees and other plants. And there's a tea house, French-inspired tea house, on one of the arms that curves out into the bay. It's very pretty. And on the opposite side, framing the tea house, there's a breakwater that serves as a boat launch. And you can see here the very Venetian style posts that are purely decorative, but they, again, tend to give it a very Italian flair. The day I was there happened to be a lot of young Latina girls who were having photo shoots for their quinceañeras celebrations. So it was kind of fun to see them strolling around the gardens. Unfortunately, of course, when Deering built this, Miami was a tiny little place. And he thought that he was building fairly far out in an area called Coconut Grove, which was a district to the south of the city. And of course, as a century has passed and now there's a lot more development. So unfortunately, from certain perspectives, you lose the beautiful isolation of being in a gorgeous mansion in the jungle. Here's the garden facade again. You could easily spend a whole day here looking at the artwork and the interiors, and then have lunch in the cafe and wander the gardens for the rest of the day. The design of the gardens was specifically done to create a lot of little outdoor rooms. So here, for example, is something they call the secret garden that's completely walled in and was originally designed for orchids, although it's too close to the ocean, so the salt water kept killing the orchids. But a lot of this exterior design was done by local workers using the local coral stone to create urns and statues and benches. Some of them are originals from Europe, but most of them were actually carved locally. And if you follow all the way down to the south, you end up at this beautiful stairway with grottos and fountains. This was originally called the Rose Garden, and now it's called the Fountain Garden, because the roses really just don't do well there, because they're only about a couple hundred feet from seawater. The entire property is surrounded by mangrove swamp. And here's the view back to the main house. And at the far south of the gardens is a mound, an artificial mound that they built and planted these trees And the house that you can see here called the Casino, which is Italian for little house, not a gambling casino, used to look out over an enormous lagoon that was all landscaped with hundreds of planted palm trees and boat moorings and so forth. And unfortunately, that part was sold off. That was the part that was sold off to the Catholic Archdiocese. So the property really ends there at this point. You'll see as you walk around, it's not unusual to see interesting birds and lizards. The little one on the left is a native lizard, but the big one on the right, the kind of mean-looking iguana, is actually not native. This is a good example of one of the invasive species, which have taken over southern Florida, mainly because they were purchased as pets, and they escape and then they breed in the wild. And so now there's actually a lot of iguanas in southern Florida. This is the more demure north side of the house that's not as elaborate, but there's a very nice gift shop and cafe and an orchid garden there. And an unusual feature is this delightful swimming pool, which is part indoors and part outdoors. I couldn't get a decent photo of the inside, but just so you can see, this is the elaborate painted and shell decorations on the inside through those arches, and then you can swim both inside and outside from the basement of the house. Moving back towards the center of the city, I did want to show you a little of downtown Miami, because a lot of people don't think to go there. Because you want to spend all your time at the beach. But it's more interesting than you might think, and it has a skyline that definitely rivals many of the other cities in the country. The most notable new addition I found was this one this is a residential tower called 1000 Museum, that being the address of the building. And it was designed by an architect called Zaha Hadid, an award-winning Iraqi architect. And she unfortunately passed away in 2017, but her firm is still building projects around the world in her very distinctive style, which tends to be very organic and with lots of curves and flows. This is a very fluid looking building. It's 62 stories high and has really expensive condos in it with amazing views of Miami. But it's quite striking. There's even a swimming pool at the top. And it makes a nice addition to the skyline, a little bit different from more stylish than some of the other ones. And it's right across the street from downtown Miami's major park, which is a very nice green space, but also one that has, in addition to the landscaping, it has a couple of really important museums. This is the Paris Art Museum, which has mostly 20th and 21st century works. And also right next door is the Frost Science Museum, which has a planetarium, an aquarium, and is really great if you're traveling with kids, because they have a lot of exhibits that are well suited to children. The park also has a lot of public art in it, lots of palm trees, and also they host a lot of public events there as well, outdoors, right next to the water. One wharf down on the next pier is the FTX arena where the Miami Heat plays. And that's also used for concerts as well. I do have to point out, here's some more interesting public art. Of course, there are palm trees everywhere. And if you've spent any time in Florida, you probably have noticed that it's a good idea to avoid parking under coconut palms, because it's not unusual to see one sitting on someone's dashboard after it has fallen right through their windshield. I spent the better part of a Sunday wandering around downtown, but even then there was a lot of traffic. I was kind of surprised to see these very expensive race cars tearing up and down the streets, making all kinds of noise. But there's a lot of interesting buildings to see. these are two of the more important ones. On the left is the Freedom Tower, which is an old newspaper tower for the Miami News, built in the 1920s, and is now a cultural center, and the Miami Museum of Art and Design is there. And it's a good example of that kind of Mediterranean revival style. And on the right is another building built about the same time, but in a more austere style. This was the county, still is the county courthouse, and was, at the time it was built, it was the very tallest building in all of Florida. And like any modern city, if you have a waterfront, you need a really big Ferris wheel with great views of the city. But much of downtown Miami has the same kind of very expensive high-rise development that you see along the beach. This is a very upscale neighborhood called Brickell Key, which is named after one of the early landowners in Miami. And the Mandarin Oriental Hotel is on this particular island. And I actually took this picture to show you this really annoying advertising billboard boat that cruises up and down. There were quite a few of these, and I found them really annoying because you're sitting enjoying the beach or enjoying walking along the waterfront, and then you'll see this barge that basically is nothing but an electronic billboard flashing in your face. I found them kind of irritating. But this whole area is just full of high-rise developments. But perhaps surprisingly, Miami actually has a pretty good transit system. And this, in fact, is a view looking north downtown from the monorail system that runs completely free through most of the downtown area. There is a much more extensive commuter rail system throughout the area, but the downtown monorail actually covers quite a bit of the downtown area and is totally free. I was minding my own business walking down the street, and in the parking lot of a bank, I heard something crowing at me, and I turned around and saw this rooster staring at me. I thought that was just kind of strange to see in the middle of a city. And there are some old buildings, very nice old buildings downtown. This one is an old arcade that was built in the 1920s. Was intended to be the base of a big tower, skyscraper, but the economic crash during the Depression canceled those plans. So the only thing that's left is the shorter building. And I thought it was kind of interesting that the symbols on the building are actually the same as the ones the old European style ship, and also the seahorses, which are the same symbols that were used at Vizcaya, the mansion we were just visiting. But it turns out they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. It's just coincidental. I wondered if James Deering had something to do with this building, but he didn't. Here's another wonderful historic building that's been very nicely restored. And the old Baptist church from the 1920s, which is currently under renovations. There's a lot of inequality in Florida, and you really see it in Miami. This is a homeless camp right across the street from the public library. They have an excellent public library, but the neighborhood is not so great. And this is one of the modern metro stations with a big residential tower looming over it. And right next to it, this old building that looks like it belongs in Venice is the old Salvation Army building. And if you pivot a little bit, you get a better view of the very modern transit complex. And the metro is very extensive. This shows it going over the Miami River, which I mentioned earlier. It's only like 5 miles long, but it's really, they've done a nice job of building development and pedestrian promenades and that kind of thing. So you can stroll the Riverwalk for quite a distance and admire the views. Here's one of the tiny little monorail cars that will whiz you around this. They have 3 interconnecting loops that will zip you around the city with nice views and totally free. This was kind of an interesting twisty building, not really downtown, it's a little further south. But it's like you took a skyscraper and kind of twisted it 90 degrees. And some other examples of the downtown district. I definitely would not feel comfortable living in one of the top floors of this tower. I don't love heights, and I definitely don't think that would be a place where I'd want a condo, no matter how much it costs. Here's a better view just looking over. If you travel across the causeway, the MacArthur Causeway is what goes back to Miami Beach over Biscayne Bay. You get a very nice view of the skyline, and also an excellent view of all the cruise ships that are lined up along Dodge Island, which is right next to that. It is today, I'm not sure whether it's completely rebounded from COVID, but for the past several years, COVID aside, it is considered the busiest cruise ship port in the world, with more than 5 million passengers every year. COVID, of course, has changed that. The cruise industry took a particularly hard hit from COVID, but they seem to be doing better now, that's for sure. The new ships are huge. I'm not a particularly big fan of cruising on large ships, but you can see quite a few up close. And the one on the left, the Oasis of the Seas, I think is one of the larger ones cruising now. It has room for 6,000 passengers and is 1,200 feet long. I should have found an image that compares one of these to the Titanic, because when you see the size of the original Titanic ship from 100 years ago and compare it to modern cruise ships, it looks like a bathtub toy. It's quite an amazing difference. You know, these are the size of downtown skyscrapers with 15 or 16 stories high. A number of the cruise lines along here have their own dedicated terminals specific to their cruise line. And a lot of the new ships have like 15, 17 decks above the water line with water slides and rock climbing and zip lines and you name it. Even here, you can see some of the these water slide tubes that you can go down several stories. And I was kind of struck by the fact that the Disney ship, the Disney cruise line here, compared to some of those other ships, the Disney, I think this one's called the Disney Magic, is actually by comparison a much smaller ship and has a much more traditional look to it than some of the modern ones. Boating is big, obviously, all over Florida. And if you're there and just want to get out on the water, you can take speedboats like this, which will bounce you over the waves. If that's not your speed, I noticed you can actually take this kind of motorized tiki bar that will just float you around the harbor and serve you mojitos. I took a few hours to go inland to visit the nearby city of Coral Gables, which is worth a few hours of your time, I think. It's a completely separate city, about 50,000 people, and it's southwest of Miami proper. It's not terribly far from the airport. And it's quite affluent, and it has some very beautiful buildings, partly because of the history of its development. It was established in the 1920s as a planned community, deliberately with a Mediterranean style theme. So it has very strict zoning and a very distinct look to the public amenities, the streets, the public buildings, and so forth. The statue on the right, which I realized if you look at it from the side, it looks quite rude. He's actually holding a parchment. That's not what you think it is. He's holding a scroll. And that statue is of George Merrick, who founded the town. And he stands in front of the city hall, which is this nice Renaissance-y revival style building. And the downtown district, which is called the Miracle Mile, was established after the Second World War to kind of spiff off the downtown and make it like a destination with quaint shops and elegant plantings and so forth. So it's full of beautiful palm trees and pedestrian areas, public artwork. They have these fun, snazzy crosswalks, artwork hanging from the trees. But even just strolling around the city is very pretty because much of the buildings, even these relatively modest row houses, are built in a very distinct Spanish Mediterranean style. And most of the big intersections in the city have these beautiful fountains in Spanish style with sculptures to mark major points in the town. And there's a big public golf course. Golf is obviously very big in Florida. And these were some of the most amazing banyan trees I saw anywhere in the area. They're huge. Banyans are a kind of tree that has multiple trunks, and as the branches spread out, they drop additional trunks down, which serve as props to hold up the tree. And they're absolutely enormous in size. Here's a close-up. They're actually a kind of fig tree, and they're originally native to India, not Florida. But a single tree can grow to an immense diameter, even though it's made up of all these different trunks. And just some typical Spanish-style homes throughout the city. This one is a little museum. This is where Merrick actually lived, the founder. He lived for a time here in Massachusetts in Duxbury on the South Shore, but when he was 12, he moved to Florida, and this was his childhood home, which is now a museum. As he got older and more wealthy and involved in various activities and setting up Coral Gables, he was also instrumental in setting up the University of Miami, which is a major part of Coral Gables today. A lot of the streets have Spanish names, and there are these cute little corner street signs, which we can't really do here because in the winter they get buried in snow, but that isn't a problem when you're in Florida. And it really feels like a world apart, even though you are remarkably close to the airport. It's a very nice, wealthy, peaceful place to be. This was unfortunately closed when I was there too for maintenance. This is called the Venetian Pool, and it has to be probably the most elegant municipal pool anywhere in the United States. They were cleaning it while I was there, but it's a very popular attraction in Coral Gables. It has a cafe and all these Italian-style buildings. It was originally a rock quarry for the kind of coral rock that you see in a lot of the buildings, and was fed with spring water from an underground aquifer. Even today, it's criticized because they drain it and refill it every single day, which is kind of mind-boggling. And of course, that's an immense amount of water, which you wouldn't think Florida can afford. But hey, this is Coral Gables. But it has come under some criticism for being rather profligate with the use of water. This is a plaza in the city named for De Soto, the Spanish explorer who was really the first European to explore the mainland of the southern US, as opposed to people like Columbus, who never actually found the mainland. They were wandering around the Caribbean, thinking they were on the other side of the planet. But there really is some beautiful houses and an interesting church too. This is you would never guess this is a congregational church. You might even be surprised to know there are congregational churches in Florida. Obviously, unlike anything that you would see in New England, built in 1923, and it's a very good example of colonial revival. With these incredible, like, Baroque entrances and the clock tower. Merrick donated the land and dedicated this church to his father. His father was a minister, actually, So there are very few parts of Coral Gables that don't have some connection to George Merrick at some point in history. Right across from that church is probably the most famous building in Coral Gables, which is the luxurious Biltmore Hotel. The tower is over 300 feet high and was supposed to imitate the tower at the Cathedral of Seville in Spain. And for a few years, it also, after it was built, was the tallest building in Florida. And even if you don't stay there, it's obviously a very expensive and luxurious place, but you can still go in. You can eat in the restaurant, you can walk around the lobby, even if you're not a guest. When Florida was becoming the place to go, particularly in the Jazz Age and afterwards, this hotel was frequented by the likes of the Roosevelts and the Vanderbilts and people like that, and even a lot of famous actors, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, even Al Capone went there at some place. It was the place to stay at that time, and even today, it's very, very nice. But like a lot of other hotels in this area during World War II, just like the others, it became a military hospital. So it was kind of interesting to see how World War II really changed even this. You wouldn't think Florida would have been so affected by things on the other side of the world, but of course it was. The modern contemporary hotel also has a spa and a conference center off to the side, and a huge golf course. They have an 18-hole golf course, and you can it's right out the back. So if you're on this is the back side of the hotel, and if you're staying on this side, you get a view of the golf course from these very fancy suites. Rooms at the hotel start several $100s a night, and the suites are, way much more than that, 1,000 or more per night. It also has a pool, very nice pool, which at one time was the largest swimming pool in the world. And Johnny Weissmuller, of all people, was the swimming instructor. Again, this is way back in like the 1930s, 20s or 30s. And there are private cabanas that you can rent for a couple $100s a day, which will give you your own private little air-conditioned room to sit in, and then you can go swim, and you can have a private waiter who will bring you food. There's big TVs where you can watch things to get cool and then go for a swim. It's quite a place. And I'm going to end the program at another place that I think is a little off the beaten path, but well worth seeing if you have the time. This is a huge botanical garden, about 83 acres, I think, established in the 1930s. And it's, probably half an hour, 45 minutes south of the city. Right down the coast. And it's a magnificent place to just stroll around if you are at all interested in tropical gardening and botany, because they have examples of all kinds of exotic trees, flowers, and other kinds of plants from around the world, not just Florida, but all over the world. This is a K-pop tree. The gardens are divided into different geographical areas, so that you can see there's a Madagascar area, an African area, a South African area. In particular, there's a very good collection of rare palm species, unusual species of palms, kind of like the odd-looking one here that almost looks like it would get up and walk away. It was started by two guys. One was named Robert Montgomery, and he named it for his friend David Fairchild, who was an avid plant collector. And had traveled the world bringing back specimens from all over the place. So there are lakes, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, there were 700 species of trees that you can see in different places in the park. There are lots of trails to explore. If you're not up for walking in the heat, you can take little golf carts around. They have a little train, or you can just walk. And there's also significant bird life. It isn't a zoo, but it would not be unusual for you to see native wildlife, particularly birds, the occasional alligator. I got lucky and saw this wonderful woodpecker up close. And they have a really nice feature called Wings of the Tropics, which is a butterfly house that has hundreds of butterflies, mostly from Central and South America, that you can walk around and you can see them up close. And the different themed gardens focus on the mostly tropical and subtropical zones around the world for obvious reasons. Those are the kinds of plants that will grow best here. They have a fantastic collection of orchids. This is a tropical fig with its unbelievable roots. They also have a beautiful section of bromeliads. Those are the kinds of plants that live on, they grow on another plant like a tree, and collect their moisture directly from the atmosphere, usually through fog and mists and condensation on their leaves. They even have a garden completely dedicated to African and Madagascar plants and trees as well. And I thought my favorite part was there's a 2-acre tropical garden, rainforest, but it's outdoors. What's interesting is it's the only such forest in the continental US. And you can go to botanical gardens in some places where they have a glassed-in conservatory, but this is actually outdoors. They do pump steam to keep it at a higher level of humidity than Florida would normally be used to. But the misting system really makes you feel like you're in a jungle somewhere in another part of the world. And it is much bigger than you would find if you were within a glass-covered botanical garden. This on the left, this is an unusual baobab tree. And they also have some permanent displays of the famous glass artist, Dale Chihuly, who you might have seen a few years ago. There was a big exhibit of his work here in Boston. And the Museum of Fine Arts still has a couple of pieces of his, but he also did an exhibit in this garden, and a few of the pieces have stayed in the permanent collection, so you can see them very artistically arranged, almost like they're actual plants in different parts of the garden. So if you want to get a little bit away from the bustle of the city and the beach, this is another place I would suggest for a little peace and quiet and some nature. It's a really delightful place, not far at all from the city. So I will end the program there. We're just about at time, and I'm going to stop my screen share and start looking at the questions. So if anybody has any questions, that you haven't put in the chat, let me think. What am I thinking? Oh, someone was asking, I have so many slides. Are these all my photos, or do I pull from websites? No, with a couple of exceptions that I indicated, these are all my own photos. A couple of those historic images of Vizcaya were obviously historic photographs, but everything else is mine. At Vizcaya, someone asks if the second floor bedrooms have always been open to the public, like in 1958. Well, I don't go back to 1958, so I can't tell you that. When I was there in the 70s, they were, but I don't think all of them were. And I think over the years, they've had to restore some of them. You can imagine the Florida weather is not particularly kind to the kind of European artwork and furnishings that a place like Vizcaya would have. So they have to worry a lot about not just hurricanes, but just ordinary heat and humidity in a place like that. There are the one place I don't think is open or wasn't when no, actually that's not true. One of them was the tower rooms. I think one of the towers was closed, but the other one that you could go into, and some of the top floor bedrooms were available there. You look back at someone asked me also about the little botanical garden. I'm going to quickly look at that, because I can tell you in a sec. Look at the map. Is that my picture of the town hall or a postcard? Oh, I think you're talking about the Chelmsford Library. I'll let Jess answer that, because I don't know if that's a postcard or an actual photo. How are the libraries in Miami and Miami Beach? I didn't really go to the libraries while I was there, which is surprising because I usually do visit libraries. Florida libraries are generally pretty good, but it can vary significantly from community to community. And I didn't actually end up going to any of the ones in I did go to the main library in downtown Miami Beach. That was the one near the homeless camp, and that is a fairly good library, but it's a big city library. Let's see, the botanical garden is called. Isn't that awful? I can't find it. Oh, here it is. It is the Miami Beach Botanical Garden. It's right next to the convention center, not far from Dade Boulevard. So it's kind of on the north. There's a couple of different causeways that go across, and there's the bridge that goes closest to it is the one called the Venetian Causeway. And so it's a little further up from the MacArthur one that goes down to the southern tip of the island. Are there any walking trails? Well, if you get out to if you head down towards the Everglades, yes, but not in Miami proper. There's not particularly a lot of walking trails. Although, as I said, the really nice pedestrian promenade that goes up and down parallel to the beach is very, very nice. But it's not really nature. It's right next to Miami Beach. I was there 10 years ago, breathtaking, like going to Europe. I assume you're talking about Vizcaya. Yes, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I would definitely recommend, assuming that you are at all interested in art and gardens and things like that. I would consider it definitely one of the top 10 things to do in the city. What are my favorite places to visit in the US? I would say outside of New England, I think I like the Pacific Northwest, any place that's a national park. I'm big on the outdoors. And I've liked a lot of the more old historic cities like Savannah and Charleston. And I actually was in St. Augustine a couple months ago, which was my first time in North Florida. And I really liked St. Augustine. I thought that was a lot of fun. New Orleans, places like that. The location of the picture currently as my backdrop is a little church in the Peloponnese, which is the village closest to the one where we have a house in Greece. I'll be going there in a couple of weeks to spend some time, and that's what it looks like. It's really nice. I like it even better than Florida. So I think I hit all the questions. I will put, if I missed anything or if you have any additional questions, I am going to put my I just popped my email into the chat, so do feel free to send me questions or comments. If you think of something later, I'm always happy to talk to people that way.
And thank you so much for your time tonight. And thank you all
Thanks for
so
having
much
me.
I saw there was a ton of questions in the chat. I've been on another meeting at the same time, but I've been sort of half listening and it sounded excellent. I can't wait to watch the recording. And I will send out the recording to all of you tomorrow as soon as I get it downloaded.
Oh, so I just noticed someone says,
Oh, sure.
can you do a presentation from Greece?
Ha,
I don't know
yeah.
if you mean a presentation about Greece. I can do that. Can I do a presentation from Greece? Probably not. One, I'll be on vacation.
Yeah.
Two, and two, the bigger issue is that we're in the middle of nowhere and the Wi-Fi is so it's also 7 hours different. So it would be yeah, I'm not doing a program at 4 o'clock in the morning. Sorry.
No, it's like
But I will be happy
yeah,
to do something when I come back.
no problem, because I mean, but all of the programs that you do on Greece, it makes us feel like we're there with you anyway.
And I will be
So
happy to
yeah,
do it again.
I think there might be a couple of Greece ones that we haven't done yet. So
I
we'll
actually
look
have
at
a
that.
couple of new ones that I'll
Oh,
talk
yeah.
to you about at some point. So yeah.
Awesome. All right.
Great.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, and I'll see you next time.
See you
Good
next
night.
time. Good night.